The wind outside the glass-paned walls of Sterling Global Logistics didn't just howl. It screamed, a bitter December gale that rattled the windows of the 34th floor. Inside, the air was climate-controlled to a perfect 72 degrees, yet David Miller couldn't stop shivering. He stood in the center of the plush, charcoal-carpeted executive suite, his hands buried deep in the pockets of a suit jacket that had seen better days, about a decade's worth of them. The fabric was shiny at the elbows, the cuffs slightly frayed, and the fit just a little too loose for a man who had forgotten what it felt like to have a full meal. He stared at the gold and silver ornaments adorning the massive spruce tree in the corner, their reflection shimmering in the polished marble floor. It was a scene of ultimate success, but to David, it felt like a funeral. He reached into his pocket and brushed his thumb against the edge of a crumpled photograph. It was Lily, his 7-year-old daughter, smiling through a hospital gown with a bravery that made his chest ache. She was recovering, the doctors said, but the recovery was a luxury they couldn't afford. The bills were a mountain he was trying to climb with bare hands. Every cough that rattled his own lungs was a reminder that he was burning the candle at both ends, working 20-hour shifts just to keep the lights on and the medicine flowing. He just needed to get through this meeting. He just needed the bonus he had earned 10 times over. The heavy oak doors swung open with a violent thud, and the scent of expensive sandalwood and overpriced scotch filled the room. Marcus Thorne walked in like he owned the oxygen everyone else breathed. His suit was a midnight blue silk that probably cost more than David's annual mortgage, and his hair was slicked back with a precision that bordered on clinical. Behind him trotted Sarah, his assistant, clutching a tablet like a shield, her eyes fixed firmly on the floor. Marcus didn't look at David. He didn't even acknowledge he was a human being standing in the room. Instead, he walked straight to his mahogany desk, tossed a pair of Italian leather gloves onto the surface, and let out a long, theatrical sigh of boredom. "Miller," Marcus said, his voice a sharp, nasal drawl that dripped with condescension. He still hadn't looked up. "I saw your car in the parking lot this morning. That rusted-out heap of metal is an eyesore. It's leaking oil on the private executive spots. It's bad for the brand, David. People see that and they think we're struggling. We're a premier logistics firm, not a charity for the displaced." David swallowed hard, his throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne. I've been meaning to get the seal fixed. It's just, things have been tight with Lily's surgery." At the mention of the child, Karen from HR stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, her heels clicking against the floor like the ticking of a doomsday clock. She adjusted her pearls and offered a tight, joyless smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "David, we've talked about this. Personal drama belongs at home. Bringing your domestic struggles into the office creates a low-energy environment. It's frankly unprofessional to use your family as an excuse for your appearance. I mean, look at your tie. Is that a stain from 3 days ago?" David looked down at his silk tie, a faded holiday pattern he'd worn to cheer up Lily. His face burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the office heater. "I apologize, Karen. I've been staying at the hospital. I just wanted to ask about the performance bonus. The shipping lanes I managed this quarter saw a 40% increase in efficiency. I was hoping." Marcus finally looked up, and the expression on his face was one of pure, amused cruelty. He reached for a crystal decanter on his desk, pouring a finger of 50-year-old scotch. "Efficiency? You think you did that, David? The system did that. You're just a glorified paper pusher in a cheap suit." Marcus stood up, walking toward David with a predatory grace. He stopped just inches away, sniffing the air with a disgusted curl of his lip. "Is that tuna? Are you actually eating canned fish in this office? It smells like a shipyard in here now." Before David could respond, Marcus tilted his hand. It was a slow, deliberate motion. The amber liquid poured out of the glass, splashing over David's desk, soaking into his meager stack of files, and dripping onto his worn shoes. Marcus watched the stain spread with a smug grin. "Oops. My hand slipped. Since you're so worried about the work environment, why don't you make yourself useful? Use that hideous tie of yours to wipe this up. It's probably the most value that piece of fabric will ever provide to this company." David stared at the puddle of scotch, the smell of alcohol filling his nostrils. He looked at Marcus, then at Karen, who was stifling a laugh behind her hand. The injustice of it was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in his chest. He thought of Lily, waiting for him to come home with her medicine, and he felt his dignity fracturing. He wasn't just a man being insulted, he was a father being pushed to the edge by people who had never known a day of true hunger in their lives. The storm wasn't just outside anymore, it was rising right there in the heart of the Sterling Global office. The golden light of a setting sun once poured through these same windows 15 years ago, but back then, the warmth felt real. A younger David Miller stood in this very office, his posture straight, his eyes bright with the fire of innovation. He wasn't the ghost of a man standing here today, he was the architect of the future. Arthur Sterling, the legendary founder of the company, sat behind the desk with a look of genuine pride that no amount of corporate posturing could fake. Arthur didn't see a worker or a blue-collar grunt. He saw a visionary. David had just finalized the logistics algorithm, a complex web of code and strategy that would eventually turn a modest shipping firm into a global empire. It was David's genius, his late nights, and his unwavering loyalty that had built the throne Marcus now sat upon so carelessly. "You have a gift, David," Arthur had said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble of respect. He had reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a velvet box, clicking it open to reveal a Founder's Edition Patek Philippe. The watch face caught the light, a masterpiece of precision and timeless elegance. "This isn't just a bonus. It's a reminder. You have the heart this company needs to survive. My son, Marcus. He has the name, but he doesn't understand the soul of the work. Promise me you'll stay. Promise me you'll keep his feet on the ground when I'm gone." David had felt a swell of pride so thick he could barely speak. He had promised. He had chosen to stay behind the scenes, favoring the stability of his growing family over the vanity of a title. But secrets have a way of festering in the dark. In the shadows of the doorway that afternoon, a teenage Marcus Thorne had watched the entire exchange. His knuckles had turned white as he gripped the doorframe, his eyes narrowed with a venomous envy. He didn't see a mentor in David, he saw a rival. He saw his father giving a stranger the validation he craved but never earned. To Marcus, every ounce of praise David received was a personal insult, a theft of his birthright. The prejudice didn't start with David's worn-out shoes or his humble demeanor. It started with the realization that David was everything Marcus was not: capable, respected, and truly seen by the man whose shadow Marcus lived in. The memory flickered and died as the harsh, fluorescent lights of the present snapped back into focus. The warmth of the past was replaced by the cold, antiseptic reality of Marcus's sneer. David looked down at his bare wrist. The Patek Philippe was gone. He remembered the gut-wrenching shame of walking into that pawn shop 6 months ago, the neon sign flickering overhead as he traded the only proof of his worth for a stack of hundreds to pay for Lily's first round of chemotherapy. He had felt like he was selling a piece of his own soul, but for Lily, he would have sold his life. Marcus noticed the movement. He leaned over the desk, his eyes scanning David's wrist with a shark-like intensity. "I couldn't help but notice, Miller. You're not wearing that watch my father gave you. What happened? Did you finally realize it looked ridiculous on a man who buys his coffee with loose change? Or did you finally sell his charity to keep your failing life afloat?" Marcus let out a sharp, jagged laugh that echoed off the cold glass walls. "You never belonged here, David. My father was a sentimental fool who fell for your honest worker act. But I see you. I see the rot. I see a man who reached his peak 15 years ago and has been sliding down the gutter ever since." David felt the sting of the words, but he didn't flinch. The internal struggle was a silent war. He wanted to scream that he had built this place, that every cent Marcus spent on his silk suits was earned by David's sweat. But he thought of the foreclosure notice sitting on his kitchen table. He thought of the empty cupboards. He swallowed his pride, a bitter pill that felt like broken glass. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on, fueled by decades of hidden truths and unearned hatred. Karen from HR cleared her throat, her voice like a paper cut breaking the silence. "Well, since we're being honest about the rot, David, your performance review has been moved up. Tomorrow morning, Christmas Eve, 9 sharp. Don't be late. We wouldn't want to start the holiday with more disappointment. She adjusted her watch, a diamond-encrusted piece that cost more than David's car, and turned her back on him, dismissing his existence with a flick of her wrist. David stood alone in the center of the room, the architect of an empire now standing amidst its ruins, waiting for the final blow to fall. Christmas Eve arrived not with a celebration, but with the cold, rhythmic thumping of a corporate execution. David Miller stepped through the revolving doors of Sterling Global at 6 in the morning, his breath hitching in the frigid air. The lobby was ghost white and silent, save for the hum of the industrial floor buffer. Leo, the night janitor, was finishing his rounds near the elevators. He was a man with a face like a roadmap of hard years, but his eyes were kind. David stopped, reaching into his pocket to pull out a small, hand-wrapped box. It was just a tin of homemade cookies and a $10 gift card for coffee, but it was all David had left to give. "Merry Christmas, Leo," David said, his voice raspy from a night spent sitting upright in a hospital chair. Leo stopped his machine, looking at the gift and then at David's hollowed-out eyes. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world, Mr. Miller," Leo whispered, his voice thick with a gravelly concern. "Just remember, the tallest buildings are built on the dirt, not the clouds. Don't let them make you forget you're the foundation." David nodded, a lump forming in his throat, and stepped into the elevator that would take him to his doom. By 9 o'clock, the entire office had been summoned to the central hub. Marcus Thorne stood on a literal pedestal, a raised platform usually reserved for award ceremonies, looking down at his employees like a king surveying a failing colony. Beside him, Karen from HR held a stack of manila envelopes with a predatory gleam in her eyes. There was no "Merry Christmas," no "Thank you for your hard work." Instead, Marcus tapped his microphone, the screeching feedback cutting through the forced holiday music. "Welcome to the Sterling Purge," Marcus announced, his voice booming with a sick, ecstatic energy. "Success is a garden, and sometimes, you have to rip out the weeds to let the flowers breathe. We've spent too much time carrying dead weight, and today, that ends." He scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on David like a laser sight. "David Miller, step forward. Let's show everyone what a weed looks like." David felt 200 pairs of eyes burn into his back. He walked to the front, his legs feeling like lead. Marcus clicked a remote, and the massive LED wall behind him flickered to life. It was a grainy security feed from 3 nights ago. It showed David sitting at his desk at 3 in the morning, his head bowed, his eyes closed. To anyone else, it looked like a man in deep prayer or a father exhausted by a dying child. To Marcus, it was a weapon. "Look at this," Marcus sneered, pointing at the frozen image of David's slumped shoulders. "While this company pays for your time, you're using it to take a nap. You're stealing from me, David. You're a thief of time, a thief of resources, and frankly, you're an embarrassment to the legacy of this firm." "Mr. Thorne, please," David started, his voice trembling. "I was working a double shift. I had just finished the London Manifest. I only closed my eyes for a minute because you're lazy," Karen interrupted, snapping her fingers as if to dismiss a stray dog. "Because you think your sob story about a sick kid gives you a free pass to be a mediocre employee. It's pathetic, David. Truly. Do you have any idea how many high performers would kill for your salary? And you spend it on what? Overdue bills and old suits?" The crowd was deathly silent. People David had mentored, people he had eaten lunch with for years, suddenly found their shoes very interesting. No one spoke. No one looked up. The isolation was more painful than the insults. "You're fired, Miller," Marcus said, the words landing like a guillotine blade. "On behalf of Sterling Global, Merry Christmas. Pack your things. Karen has your final check, minus the cost of the scotch you made me waste yesterday. And don't bother asking for a reference. I've already sent a memo to every logistics firm in the tri-state area. You're blacklisted. You couldn't get a job delivering mail after today." David stood there, the cardboard box Karen shoved into his chest feeling heavier than an anvil. He turned to leave, walking through the gauntlet of silent colleagues. As he reached the elevator, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Leo. The janitor didn't say a word, he just helped David steady the box as the doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of Marcus Thorne's triumphant laughter. David stepped out into the biting December wind, his career dead, his reputation ruined, and his daughter's future disappearing into the gray, winter sky. He sat in his car, the engine refusing to turn over on the first try, and realized he wasn't just losing his job. He was losing everything. The driveway of David's small, suburban home was dusted with a thin, mocking layer of white snow. It should have looked like a postcard, but all David could see was the bright neon orange sticker plastered against his front door. He didn't need to read the bold, black letters to know what it said: foreclosure. The bank didn't care about Christmas miracles, and they certainly didn't care about a father who had just been blacklisted by the most powerful man in the city. David slumped against the steering wheel of his shivering car, the engine clicking as it died. He sat in the deafening silence of the afternoon, the cold seeping through the floorboards and into his bones. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life. For months, he had been a victim of circumstance, a man playing defense against a world that wanted to crush him. But as he looked at that orange notice, something inside him finally snapped. It wasn't a loud break, it was a quiet, icy realization. He was done being the prey. He climbed out of the car and walked past the notice, entering the dark, silent house. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't need them. He walked straight to the basement, to a heavy, antique floor safe that had belonged to his father. His hands were steady now, his breathing slow and rhythmic. He dialed the combination, numbers that represented the date Arthur Sterling had founded the company. The heavy iron door groaned open, revealing not a stack of cash or a pile of gold, but a single, thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. It was the Golden Proxy, a document so powerful that Arthur had called it the heart monitor of the company. David pulled it out, the high-quality parchment feeling heavy and significant in his hands. He sat on the cold basement floor and read the words he had memorized years ago. The ethics clause was clear. If the CEO's leadership resulted in a mass termination event that bypassed the standard board review, or if the human capital value fell below a set threshold due to documented mistreatment, the silent trustee, David Miller, had the immediate authority to freeze all corporate assets and dissolve the board of directors. Marcus Thorne had been so blinded by his own ego, so desperate to purge the weeds, that he had walked straight into a legal minefield laid 15 years ago. Marcus thought he was a king, but he was just a tenant, and David was the landlord. The transformation was instantaneous. The slumped shoulders straightened. The tired, hollow look in David's eyes was replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. He wasn't a white dad begging for a bonus anymore, he was the kingmaker. He reached for his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in over a decade. It was a direct line to a high-end legal firm in Manhattan that specialized in corporate decapitation. When the voice on the other end answered, David didn't hesitate. "This is David Miller. The Sterling Trust has been violated. Activate the Kingmaker Protocol. I want every bank account, every subsidiary, and every private equity line tied to Marcus Thorne frozen by midnight. And get me a tailor. I have a meeting on the 26th that I cannot be late for." He hung up the phone and looked at the photograph of Lily sitting on the workbench. He wasn't going to cry. He wasn't going to beg. He was going to play the long game. Marcus Thorne thought he had won because he had taken David's job, but David was about to take Marcus's entire world. He spent the rest of the night in that dark basement, not as a victim, but as a general. He mapped out every embezzlement Sarah had hinted at, every labor violation Karen had covered up, and every lie Marcus had told the shareholders. By the time the sun began to peek over the snowy horizon on Christmas morning, the trap was set. David Miller walked upstairs, made himself a cup of black coffee, and smiled for the first time in a year. The trash was about to be taken out, and he was the one who was going to handle the collection. Christmas Day was a ghost in the Miller household. There were no brightly wrapped boxes under the tree, and the refrigerator hummed a lonely tune, containing little more than a half-empty carton of milk and some leftover hospital jello. To any neighbor peering through the frost-rimmed windows, David Miller looked like a man defeated, a casualty of the corporate machine. But inside the dim light of his small study, David was anything but broken. He was a predator in the tall grass. He spent the morning not in mourning, but in a flurry of encrypted emails and hushed phone calls. Sarah, Marcus's overworked and invisible assistant, had finally reached her breaking point after being forced to work through the holiday. She began funneling attachments to David, PDFs of offshore accounts, falsified shipping manifests, and private memos where Marcus explicitly detailed his plan to gut the legacy staff to inflate the year-end margins. Each chime of David's computer was another nail in Marcus Thorne's gilded coffin. Across town, in a penthouse that overlooked the city like a fortress of glass and ego, Marcus Thorne was celebrating. The air smelled of expensive cigars and aged Wagyu beef. He swirled a glass of vintage Bordeaux, laughing as he regaled his inner circle with the story of the Christmas purge. He described the look on David's face with a cruel, rhythmic delight, mimicking the way the old man had clutched his cardboard box. Karen sat nearby, her manicured fingers scrolling through social media as she sipped champagne. She laughed along, noting that the office already felt lighter, without the depressing atmosphere of struggling parents. To them, David was a memory, a piece of trash they had successfully discarded before the new year. Marcus toasted to his own genius, convinced that by firing the man who actually knew how the company ran, he had finally proven he was greater than his father. While the champagne flowed in the penthouse, David was in a nondescript office downtown, meeting with a team of 3 silver-haired auditors and a high-stakes labor attorney. The room was cold, lit only by the blue glow of 4 different monitors. David didn't look tired anymore. The dark circles under his eyes seemed to have sharpened into war paint. He watched as the attorney highlighted the ethics clause in the golden proxy. "It's ironclad, David," the lawyer whispered, sliding a fountain pen across the table. "The moment he fired you without cause during a protected medical leave period, while simultaneously violating the founder's bylaws, he triggered a total asset freeze. He just doesn't know the ice has already cracked under his feet." David signed the final document with a steady hand. He wasn't just taking back his job, he was preparing to reclaim the entire Sterling legacy. As the sun began to set on Christmas Day, David made one final stop. He didn't go to a church or a bar, he went to the hospital to see Lily. He sat by her bed, listening to the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. He leaned in and whispered into her ear, "Just a little longer, honey. Daddy's bringing the stars down for you." He left the hospital and drove straight to an elite bespoke tailor who had opened his doors exclusively for a chairman's emergency. As the tailor measured David's shoulders for a charcoal wool suit, the kind of suit that didn't just command respect, but demanded total surrender, David caught his reflection in the 3-way mirror. The humble dad was gone. The man staring back was the one Arthur Sterling had always intended to lead. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and as the clock ticked toward the 26th, David Miller prepared to deliver a lesson in karma that the city would never forget. The morning of December 26th arrived with a sky the color of cold slate, but inside the boardroom of Sterling Global, the atmosphere was white-hot with anticipation. Marcus Thorne stood at the head of the long, obsidian-topped conference table, checking his reflection in the window. He adjusted his white silk tie, a stark contrast to the dark city behind him. Today was the day he would finalize a merger that would scrub his father's sentimental fingerprints off the company forever. Karen from HR stood by the door, acting as a velvet rope, her chin tilted upward as she scanned the room. She was busy ignoring the junior associates, her fingers dancing across her phone as she muttered about the lack of high-class catering for such a historic morning. The room was packed with the city's most influential investors and the remaining members of the board, men and women who had served under Arthur Sterling for decades. They sat in a heavy, expectant silence, their eyes fixed on Marcus. Sarah, the assistant, moved through the shadows with a stack of thick, leather-bound folders. Her face was a mask of professional neutrality, but her hands trembled slightly as she placed a specific file in front of Marcus. She didn't look at him, she couldn't. She knew that the man she had served was standing on a trapdoor, and the rope was about to be pulled. "All right," Everyone, let's settle in, Marcus announced, his voice booming with a hollow, performative confidence. He leaned over the table, his knuckles resting on the polished surface. I know it's the day after Christmas, but when you're building an empire, there are no holidays. We've trimmed the fat, we've removed the dead weight of the past, and now, we move into a new era of pure profit. I've called this emergency session to sign the final dissolution of the old bylaws. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh, looking toward Karen. I only wish our former manager, Mr. Miller, could see us now. He's probably standing in a breadline right about now, wondering where it all went wrong. Karen chuckled, a dry, grating sound. He probably couldn't even afford the bus fare to get here to watch his own funeral, Marcus. Some people are just born to be at the bottom. The heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open with a slow, deliberate creak. The chatter died instantly. A man stepped into the room, and for a heartbeat, no one recognized him. He was wearing a charcoal wool suit that fit him like armor, tailored with a precision that radiated silent authority. His shoes didn't squeak, they thudded with the weight of a man who owned the ground he walked on. As he stepped into the light, Marcus's smug expression didn't break, it curdled. It was David Miller, but the hunched shoulders were gone. The hollow, desperate look in his eyes had been replaced by a gaze so sharp it felt like a physical strike. Security, Marcus screamed, his voice cracking as he slammed his palm onto the table. Karen, why is this man in my boardroom? I fired him. Get this trash out of my sight before I have him arrested for trespassing. Karen scrambled forward, her face turning a blotchy red as she snapped her fingers at David. Did you not hear the man? You are terminated. You have no right to be in this building, let alone this room. Leave now, or I will personally call the police and ensure you spend the rest of the week in a cell. She reached out as if to grab David's arm, but he didn't even look at her. He simply kept walking until he reached the foot of the table, standing directly opposite Marcus. The board members began to whisper, their heads turning like spectators at a duel. David reached into his jacket and pulled out a single, gold-embossed card, placing it on the table. He leaned forward, his voice low, steady, and vibrating with an authority that made the air in the room feel heavy. I'm not here for a job, Marcus. And I'm certainly not here for your permission. I'm here because according to the Sterling Trust, this meeting cannot proceed without the majority trustee. And as of midnight, that trustee has arrived. Marcus let out a hysterical, high-pitched laugh, looking around the room for support. Trustee? You're a middle manager who couldn't even pay for his kid's surgery. You're a loser, David. You're nothing. He grabbed the folder Sarah had placed in front of him, waving it in the air. I'm signing this deal right now, and then I'm going to watch the guards drag you out of here in handcuffs. Read the first page, Marcus, David said, his voice cutting through Marcus's tirade like a knife through silk. Read it carefully, because if you sign that document, you aren't signing a merger. You're signing a confession. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the room was locked on Marcus's shaking hand as he opened the folder, the smell of expensive paper and impending doom filling the space between them. The silence in the boardroom was no longer respectful, it was suffocating. Marcus Thorne's fingers trembled as he gripped the edge of the leather-bound folder, his knuckles white against the dark wood. He scanned the first page, his eyes darting frantically across the lines of legal text. Slowly, the arrogant flush on his face began to fade, replaced by a sickly, translucent gray. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a faint, wet clicking noise. The merger he thought he was signing was actually a comprehensive forensic audit and a voluntary surrender of executive power, triggered by the very bylaws he had mocked. This is a mistake, Marcus finally stammered, his voice thin and reedy, a ghost of its former booming self. This isn't what we discussed. Sarah, what is this? What did you put in front of me? He turned to his assistant, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fury. Sarah didn't flinch. She stood tall, her arms crossed, looking at him with a calm, cold clarity. I put the truth in front of you, Marcus, she said, her voice echoing with a newfound strength. I sent Mr. Miller everything. The offshore transfers, the doctored payrolls, and every single email where you and Karen joked about purging the poor. It's all there. Karen from HR let out a shrill, hysterical laugh, her hand flying to the diamond pendant at her throat. This is ridiculous. David, you think because you put on a nice suit that you can just walk in here and take over? You're an ex-employee. You're a nobody. Marcus, call the police. Have him dragged out of here. She turned to the board members, her eyes darting around the room for an ally. Someone do something. This man is a fraud. The chairman of the board, a man whose hair was as silver as the Sterling legacy, stood up slowly. He looked at Karen with a disgust so profound it seemed to physically push her back. Sit down, Karen, he commanded. The room went deathly quiet. He turned his gaze toward David, a look of deep, mournful respect in his eyes. David, I apologize on behalf of this board. We were blind to what was happening under this roof. We forgot the man who actually built the foundations of this company while we were chasing margins. He looked at Marcus, his voice turning to ice. Marcus Thorne, as of 5 minutes ago, the Sterling Trust has been activated. By unanimous vote of the trustees, you are hereby removed as CEO, effective immediately. Your personal and corporate accounts have been frozen pending a full criminal investigation into embezzlement and labor violations. Marcus slumped back into his oversized leather chair, his white silk tie now looking like a noose. You can't do this, he whispered, his eyes glazed. This is my name. This is my father's company. David Miller stepped closer, leaning his hands on the table and looking Marcus directly in the eyes. The power in David's voice wasn't loud, it was heavy, the kind of weight that comes from 15 years of silent integrity. It was never your company, Marcus. You just lived in it. You thought that firing a father on Christmas was a show of strength, but all you did was prove you were too weak to lead. You called me trash. You told me I didn't belong here. David reached down and tapped the face of the Patek Philippe on his wrist, the one he had reclaimed that morning. But I'm the one who kept the lights on while you were busy trying to put them out in everyone else's lives. The double doors at the back of the room opened again, but this time, it wasn't a lone man. 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside, followed by a plainclothes detective. The sound of their heavy boots on the marble floor sounded like the final gavel of a long-delayed judgment. The detective walked straight to Marcus, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clink of the cuffs snapping shut around Marcus's wrists was the most satisfying sound David had ever heard. Marcus Thorne, you're under arrest for grand larceny and corporate fraud, the detective stated firmly. Marcus began to sob, a pathetic, blubbering sound that filled the prestigious room. He looked at David, his face wet with tears. David, please. I'll give it all back. I'll give you a promotion. We can fix this. David didn't look away. He didn't gloat. He simply watched as the man who had tried to destroy his family was led away in shame. Then, he turned his attention to Karen. She was frozen, her mouth agape, her expensive handbag clutched to her chest as if it could protect her. Karen, David said, his voice as calm as a winter morning. Pack your things. And don't bother with the cardboard box. Security will be escorting you to the sidewalk. Anything you left behind will be donated to the local shelter. I believe you once said you didn't do charity. Well, today, you're going to be the biggest donor we've ever had. As the room burst into a flurry of motion and hushed whispers, David Miller finally took a breath, the weight of the world lifting off his shoulders as justice was served cold, sharp, and absolute. The chaos of the boardroom eventually faded into a profound, ringing silence as the police led Marcus Thorne away, his expensive leather shoes scuffing pitifully against the floor. For the first time in years, the air in the building felt like it actually belonged to the people who breathed it. David Miller stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the flashing red and blue lights of the squad cars disappear into the city traffic below. It was over. The man who had tried to erase David's existence was now a headline in a corporate scandal, and the Karen of the HR department was currently standing on the icy sidewalk, clutching a designer handbag that would likely be hawked for legal fees by the end of the month. The immediate transformation of Sterling Global was nothing short of a revolution. David didn't spend his first day as chairman firing everyone who had stayed silent during the purge. Instead, he spent it listening. He called Leo the janitor into the executive suite, not to clean a spill, but to sit on the velvet sofa and discuss the new retirement fund. He promoted Sarah to vice president of operations, giving her the authority and the salary she had earned 3 times over. David's first official act was to sign a decree that became known as the Lily Clause, guaranteeing that no employee would ever have to choose between their paycheck and their child's health. He used his personal stake to establish a foundation that paid off the medical debts of every family in the local pediatric ward, ensuring that no other father would have to stand in a dark basement counting coins while his daughter fought for her life. 5 years passed with the steady, quiet rhythm of a life well lived. On a crisp December afternoon, David pulled his SUV into the parking lot of a local community center. He wasn't wearing a $3,000 suit today, just a simple, warm sweater and the old Patek Philippe watch that Arthur Sterling had given him so long ago. Beside him, Lily, now 12 years old, healthy, and vibrant with a laugh that could light up a stadium, hopped out of the car, clutching a stack of donated blankets. They walked toward the entrance, passing a man sitting on a nearby bench. The man was hunched over, his clothes thin and threadbare against the biting wind. He was holding a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps," but his eyes were fixed on the ground, too ashamed to look up. As David walked by, he stopped and reached into his pocket. He didn't just drop a few coins. He handed the man a warm meal voucher and a business card for a local vocational training center. The man looked up, and for a fleeting second, their eyes met. It was Marcus. His face was weathered, his once perfect hair now a messy tangle of gray, and the arrogance that once defined him had been hollowed out by the cold reality of his own choices. Marcus didn't recognize the man in the warm sweater, but David saw the ghost of the boy who had once envied him. David didn't feel anger, nor did he feel a surge of pride. He felt a quiet, heavy pity. He patted the man on the shoulder, a simple gesture of human dignity, and walked inside with his daughter. Life has a way of coming full circle, a slow and deliberate orbit that ensures we eventually meet the shadows we cast. Marcus had spent his life trying to build a throne out of other people's broken spirits, only to find himself sitting in the rubble. David had spent his life building a foundation out of integrity and sacrifice, and now he stood in a house made of light. As he watched Lily hand a blanket to a shivering child, David realized that the greatest victory wasn't the wealth or the title. It was the fact that he had kept his heart soft in a world that tried to make it stone. Karma isn't a shadow that follows you in the dark, it is a mirror that waits for you in the light. It doesn't miss a single act of cruelty, and it never forgets a single act of kindness. You can spend your life trying to climb over the heads of others, but eventually, the ground will claim its due. In the end, we are not remembered for the money we made or the power we held, but for the way we treated those who could do absolutely nothing for us. Because at the end of every storm, the only thing left standing is the truth of who you were when the world wasn't watching.